In the 1960s, a wave of rebellion was sweeping the planet. One of the places it reached was Hong Kong, then part of the British Empire. In 1967, for several months, workers in the city fought their bosses and British colonial authorities with strikes, riots, and bombs. This is working class history. At its height, the British Empire covered a quarter of the Earth's surface, a fifth of its population, and Britain has invaded or had some level of military incursion into about 90% of the world's nearly 200 countries. Its death toll is truly incalculable, and its crimes are too numerous to list here, but they include things like genocides of indigenous people in North America, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, enforced famines in India and Ireland, concentration camps in Kenya, Malaya, South Africa, the list goes on. But in Britain, lots of people are really proud of the empire. Opinion polls generally show around 40 to 60% of people say they're proud of it, with only about 15 to 20% being ashamed of it. But with the way that the empire is spoken about in the press and taught in schools, it's not really surprising. Just taking myself as an example, in the entirety of my education in British schools, I got one 40-minute lesson on the British Empire about India, and we didn't learn about the Amritsar massacre or the Bengal famine or anything like that. What we would talk about was a thing called the Black Hole of Calcutta. So the lesson pretty much went that British people went to India to build railways and teach them how to play cricket. But one day some ungrateful local ruler attacked a British fort, took the people inside prisoner and then locked them up in a small hot room, causing a lot of them to die of suffocation or heat exhaustion. So yes, not a very nice thing, but it was around 40 to 140 deaths, so peanuts compared to the numbers killed by the British. Also, this happened in 1756, so trains and railways hadn't been invented yet, and my teacher never really explained why you needed forts full of soldiers to teach people cricket. But anyway, especially as a British person, and yes, I am British, although lots of Americans seem to mistake me for an Australian, I've personally wanted to do more to learn and talk about the real history of the empire, which isn't censored or anything in the UK, but as George Orwell writes in his really insightful essay, The Freedom of the Press, certain things are simply, quote, not done to talk about. As a bit of an aside, that essay about unofficial censorship in the UK was actually written as the preface for Animal Farm originally. And in a pretty ridiculous bit of Orwellian irony, the essay itself has been unofficially censored simply by being left out from nearly every print edition of the book. You know, do feel free to check your print edition if you have one and see if it's there. It probably won't be. So we're going to be doing a series of podcast episodes about the British Empire, and this first one is about what are known as the Hong Kong riots of 1967. Now that name's not really that accurate a description of what happened, but, you know, the riots or leftist riots is how they're generally spoken about. I was in Hong Kong the other week and was very happy to be able to sit down and speak with three people who were there at the time, as well as a friend and historian who interpreted for me.
我叫做周奕。
My name is Zhou Yi, Chau Yick. So in 1967, I was working in One Way Pole, a newspaper. So I was a reporter and I followed the whole 67 event from the beginning to the end. I was doing journalism work by that time.
我係梁寶龍。 當年六七嘅時候，我讀緊小學嘅。
My name is Lam Bun. In 1967, I was still studying in primary school. I was really young by that time.
Lam Po Lung is also a grassroots historian who has written numerous books on Hong Kong people's history.
我徐日強，我年我11歲，我其實冇參加嘅，主要係我老豆參加。
I am Chui Yat Keung. In 1967, I am 11 years old. I didn't participate in the 67 incident, but my father was participating in it.
We were also very grateful to our final interviewee for interpreting for us.
Hi, I am Lala and I study in Taiwan, but my research topic is on the 70s Hong Kong social movement. And in order to understand the 70s social movement. You really have to understand 67, because without 67 riots, there won't be a tide of social movements in early 70s.
To start off, I think it'd be helpful to give a bit of background info on what Hong Kong is and how it came to be a British colony. Hong Kong is a city made up of three main areas: Hong Kong Island in the south, Kowloon Peninsula to the north, and the much larger adjoining New Territories, which include about 200 outlying islands. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a lot of demand in Britain for Chinese goods, stuff like tea, silk and porcelain. So this created a big trade deficit between the two countries, which drained Britain's silver reserves. So to counteract this, Britain did already sell opium to China, which was grown in Britain. But the British East India Company, the private corporation which essentially ran colonial India, started growing opium there and smuggling it into China illegally. This was really successful and it reversed the trade surplus. But in China, it caused a lot of problems, both in terms of reducing their silver supply and also in terms of the social problems associated with widespread opium addiction. Chinese authorities tried various methods to try to stem the trade, including appealing to Queen Victoria's moral responsibility, but surprisingly enough, that was unsuccessful. So eventually they started using force and started seizing opium. In 1839, the British government went to war with China. By 1842, faced with Britain's far superior naval power, China had to surrender, and as part of the treaty forced on them, they had to cede Hong Kong Island to Britain. This wasn't quite enough for Britain, however, who still wanted the full legalisation of the opium trade. So in 1856, aided by France, Britain attacked again. After 4 years, China had to surrender once more and was forced to legalise the opium trade, and then they had to hand over Kowloon Peninsula to Britain, and even pay compensation to Britain and France, and do other things like allow Christians the right to start evangelising in China. So a bit later on, after China's defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, European powers thought it would be a good time to take advantage of China's weakened state to force a number of concessions on them, principally in terms of rent-free leases on different areas. So in 1898, Britain demanded and was given full jurisdiction over an area of around 1,000 square kilometres, which became known as the New Territories, with a 99-year lease. The following year, there was a rebellion against the colonial government in the New Territories, but it was crushed by British troops, although the rebellion did achieve a number of concessions like preserving land rights and traditional customs, and descendants of these pre-1898 inhabitants continue to enjoy these rights to date. During World War II, Hong Kong was occupied by the Japanese, and after its defeat, despite the fact that the Allied victors in the war all committed themselves to the principle of national self-determination, Britain took back control of the city. Hong Kong had always been an important trading post, but after World War II, the economy began to change.
According to Zhou Yick, because of the end of Second World War, there were a lot of mainland Chinese people went across the border to come to Hong Kong. So there was first an increase in population in Hong Kong. Secondly, these people, after they come to Hong Kong because of the end of World War II, there was a baby boom. So even more newborn babies were coming out by that time. So by the year of 1967, there were a lot of angry young teenagers. So why were they angry? Because first, they were deprived of education. There were not enough schools, so they couldn't go to school and get education. The second is because there was not enough job vacancy. So there was a high unemployment rate. So there was a very strong feeling of resentment in the society.
This increase in population, coupled with high unemployment, meant there was a large pool of cheap labour ripe for exploitation in the factories. And so the manufacturing industry, particularly of plastic goods and textiles, expanded rapidly. And it was the conditions and grievances of these workers which largely led to the outburst in 1967.
According to Chau Yick, in 1967, workers didn't have any legal protection. For example, if a boss wants to fire any worker, they can just fire him directly and then only needs to pay 1 day salary compensation. So besides, there were also no welfare for the workers. And for all Hong Kong people by that time, because we were under the British colonial rule, so there was some sort of national oppression, and people were really angry about that. So the anger accumulated and it bursted out, and then so the 67 incident happened.
Nationalist opposition to British colonialism in Hong Kong basically had two wings. A left wing, which was supportive of the People's Republic of China, PRC, and a right wing supportive of the Kuomintang, or KMT, which was by then based in Taiwan. Each wing also had its own trade unions. So the Hong Kong Federation of Trade Unions, FTU, which was pro-Beijing, and the Hong Kong and Kowloon Trades Union Council, or HKTUC, which was pro-KMT.
如果講到民族主義咧，當時嘅民族主義同而家係
According to Lam Bun, by that time, the nationalism is very different from the nationalism nowadays in Hong Kong. For example, if we talk about nationalism today in Hong Kong, people usually regard that as kind of nationalism towards PRC. But in 1967, there were still two different kinds of nationalism. Although the 67 incident was mainly organized by leftists who are pro-PRC. But we can see in 1956, there was also a riot that is organized by KMT supporters. So there are two different kinds of nationalism, at least we can see during the 50s and the 60s. One is pro-KMT and one is pro-Communist Party and pro-PRC. But anyways, because of the British colonial rule has a lot of national oppression towards all Hong Kong people, no matter you are left or right. So there was a national sentiment being suppressed, and the anger accumulated. It was just waiting for something to trigger, to explode.
One of the key events, which was a precursor to 1967, was the series of protests in 1966 against a proposed price increase for the Star Ferry, which was the main way of getting from Hong Kong Island to Kowloon. The protests were violently repressed by the police, which caused mass outrage, and the protests were ultimately unsuccessful, but they contributed to an atmosphere of defiance.
當時我年紀細，好多嘢都係老豆感染到嘅。就如果你話真係
According to Chui Yat Keung, I didn't really know what happened when it was in 1967 because I was too young by that time. But what I know was from my father because he was involved in it. But I can still remember by that time in 1966 when the Star Ferry riot happened. Most people were really excited about that. So they were saying something like, oh, we should teach the British people a lesson. Finally, they should learn a lesson from us. So they were really happy about that. But all I can remember by that time about the British colonial rule was that we were forced to learn English. Although I was the second best student in my class, but because my English result was too bad and I failed my English, so I couldn't even continue my study at school.
我想就頭先阿小強講英語嗰部分咧，我又補充翻嘢，因為
So according to Leung Po Lung, I was very rebellious by that time, although I knew that I would have a better future if I went into English school. We have English school and Chinese schools by that time. When you go into the secondary school, you can choose whether or not you want to get into an English school or Chinese school. But because I was very rebellious of that time, so I didn't want to go to an English school. I chose to study in a Chinese school purposefully.
These resentments were all still bubbling in Hong Kong when something happened in nearby Macau. To save time editing, from this point on, we're just including the audio of the English translations of people's comments.
According to Zhou Yi, to answer the question how did the 67 protests begin, there is a simple answer or a short answer or a long answer for that. But we have to make sure we know about the social context or the social atmosphere by that time. Was that people were really angry about the government. There was a sense of grievance in the society. And secondly, just right before 67, there was a historical event in Macau. An incident happened in Macau called the 123 incident. So the Macau people stood up and fight against the colonial government, and it succeeded to let to make the government kind of bow down and agree with what they asked for. So the leftists in Hong Kong were really encouraged by, thrilled by what happened in Macau, and they were hoping to learn from the leftists in Macau and to copy the thing to Hong Kong and to fight against the colonial government.
Now, Macau is a small collection of islands, only about 40 kilometres from Hong Kong, which was then a Portuguese colony. Some of its residents had a plot of land and had tried to get permission from Portuguese authorities to build a private school sponsored by leftist groups. But they didn't receive any reply from authorities, so they just went ahead and started building it. But at some point, authorities came in, stopped them building the school, and then police attacked and arrested numerous demonstrators. On December the 3rd, so 12/3, the reason for the name 123, riots broke out. Police killed 8 people and injured hundreds, and they declared martial law. But protests continued, and eventually Portuguese authorities were forced to cave in to all the protesters' demands. So by the end of it, Macau was effectively left under the de facto control of the PRC, while the Portuguese just continued to have a nominal presence. Events in Macau had a lot to do with the Cultural Revolution which was going on in China. So to sum up very briefly, the Cultural Revolution was a movement launched by Mao Zedong, chairman of the Communist Party of China, CPC. He said that capitalist and revisionist elements had infiltrated the government and needed to be removed in a violent struggle. So Red Guards formed throughout the country to purge the more conservative faction of the party bureaucracy. It was, in general, a very turbulent and chaotic situation, and Red Guards were involved in the riots in the Macau 123 incident. Many commentators attribute the 1967 riots to the Cultural Revolution as well, but, attributing it just to that is a bit simplistic. Our interviewees all acknowledged that it was a factor, but disagreed on the extent of its importance. But the specific trigger of the riots was a strike at a plastic flower factory, and how the police responded.
According to Lam Po Lung, when people talk about 67 riots, they usually relate it to the Cultural Revolution in China. Of course, the two incidents have some kind of connection, but you cannot say the 67 riots was totally because of Cultural Revolution, because there was still a context in Hong Kong that really we should notice. For example, before 67, before the May of 67, there were actually 6 to 7 worker struggle already. However, those struggle could be solved through collective bargaining, could be resolved through negotiation. The workers and the boss could have a certain consent, and they didn't really escalate into anything bigger. But in 67, first there was a worker struggle, and then it happened in a plastic flower factory. However, this time the police responded by really violent acts. The riot police came in and then they beat up people. And then this was also, this is very abnormal by that time. So this may also be a reason why it had to escalate into something bigger. According to Chui Yat Keung, when we talk about 67 riots, I still think we cannot say there was no Cultural Revolution influence in it. For example, if you look into 1966, the Star Ferry riot, by that time the leftists didn't even bother to intervene in or to join it. And I think the reason why the leftists in 1967, they intervened in it, it was mainly because of Cultural Revolution somehow. So for everything that happens, there is always inside cause and an outside cause, meaning there's always something that is related to its own context, but there's also something that is out of the context but still influences the incident. There is another reference that I would like to talk about is the 1967 April. There was a central taxi strike. By that time, the police didn't intervene in the strike, and there was no police beating people up. So it was not like the 67 plastic flower factory worker struggle where the police were really involving in it and they were cracking down. According to Zhou Yi, I agree that the whole 67 incident has a lot to do with the worker struggle. I think the plastic flower factory strike was the focal point of social contradiction by that time. So the plastic flower factory was a really big factory. They have different branches in Kowloon side and also the Hong Kong Island side. So by that time, the workers, the boss was trying to cut down their bonus. And the workers were really angry about that, so they stand up and fight against their boss. And the boss responded by firing all the factory workers. So the workers were really angry about that, so they have struggle, they have strike. And we can see that the second reason why the 67 incident happened was because of Hong Kong people were really angry about the police. So before the 67 incident, usually Hong Kong people, the proletariat in Hong Kong, although they were under colonial oppression, they usually tend not to fight against the government because they are usually too scared to do anything. They just accept everything, and then, but this kind of the anger was suppressed for too long. So this was the plastic flower factory strike really make them angry. What they saw was that the police into the strike, and they used the police baton to hit people, hit their head actually, so there was blood everywhere. So, and not only was the workers being beaten up by the police, a lot of other onlookers, which includes teenagers and students and also actually teenagers who are deprived of education because they have nothing to do, so they are the onlookers. So the police even hit those innocent onlookers, and this really made everyone very angry.
One important element about this first strike was that it was by both communist and non-communist unions at the factory. Before the attack on the striking workers and bystanders, lots of Hong Kong people already had a great deal of distrust towards the police.
According to Chui Yat Keung, the police by that time was really bad to the people. They're really violent. For example, I can talk about one case, that is the death of Lo Kei. Lo Kei was one of the activists who joined the 1966 Star Ferry riot. But after the riot, people found him committed suicide. But that was a very suspicious and mysterious suicide. First, because Lo Kei didn't look like a person who would commit suicide. So a lot of people suspected it was an assassination done by the British government. This is just an example to show how brutal the police force was by that time. They can actually do anything.
Another Star Ferry protest organiser, So Sao Chung, who worked as a translator, protested with others against the suicide verdict. But he got arrested and was sent to a psychiatric hospital for 2 weeks.
According to Zhou Yi, usually if some kind of worker struggle happened and there was a suppression, most of the time it would just end it that way. Like people will continue to fight and struggle because a lot of people didn't think they stand a chance to fight against the colonial government. But in 1967, this time is different. First was because they were encouraged by the Cultural Revolution in China. So what they saw was that the Red Guards in China were really brave, that they were fighting against the bureaucracy and people in power. So they were encouraged first by the Red Guards, and second because of the 123 incident that happened in Macau. So the leftist workers and people and union members, they thought maybe we should not be chickened out, maybe we should just fight against the colonial police directly. And this is the first reason why, how it escalated. So what happened afterwards, after the police beating up people and onlookers who were actually innocent, the leftists, they motivated through their union network and started a protest. So they marched to the government house in Central and I was one of those who joined the protest.
Police violence against strikers and bystanders backfired in this case, in more ways than one.
According to Lam Bun Lung, when the police hits not only the workers but also the ongoers, the police is actually helping to spread the strike into a massive social movement. So what happened was that the factory locates in Sampokong, and then when the police was chasing after the students, the teenagers, the onlookers, the workers, these people, they have to escape, so they spread to other districts. So the nearby district is Wangdaixin. So it happened that different people in different districts were able to witness themselves the brutality of the police. So because a lot of people, they saw with their own eyes how brutal and how violent the police was. So they were really angry about the police, and this explained why so many people joined the leftist protest to the government house. So even I would say that the people were lining up to get to the government house. A lot of people joined. So that was how it kind of spread it.
So confrontations with the police proliferated around the city.
So according to Chau Yick, the police first came out to target the workers at first. But later, it happened that whenever the police appeared, there will be people gathering around the police trying to figure out what happened. So there are many people gathering on the street. So whenever police appear, people would gather, and then when police trying to ask these people to go away, when they will hit the people, and people will respond by booing those police. So this kind of formed a vicious cycle, meaning that whenever there's police and then there's and they're trying to ask people to go away, and then people will boo and then continue, and then so that is why a lot of people who originally gathered only in the factory area, they spread to Wangdaixin, and then the police will chase after them. And after 2 days, there was there was a person found dead because of the police violence. So the first dead person is a 15-year-old man called Chan Guangsang. So he was a hairdresser. So he was found dead at the corridor of a resettlement area building. So it is believed that he was trying to boo the police downstairs, and the police reacted by firing riot gun bullet towards this guy, and then he died.
Police killing a teenage boy caused even more outrage, and more workers started to protest.
So after the workers' strike in the factory area, the plastic flower factory, and after the death of Chan Guangsang, according to Zhou Yick, the end of May, there started to be more wildcat strikes. So the workers of that time, they would adopt a method they copied or they learned from the Chinese Cultural Revolution called sticking up big character posters. So these big character posters, they would write their demands on the posters and stick it on at different places. So usually they would stick it on some colonial government departments, or they would stick it on the bus, on the Star Ferries. So the first wildcat strike broke out in the Star Ferry company. Some workers, they were posting big character posters at their company, and the capitalists, their boss, tear them down. So the workers reacted by having a worker strike. So a lot of wildcat strikes followed this formula, meaning the workers posted big character posters, and then the boss will tear them down, and then it will happen and escalate into a strike. According to Lam Bun Lung, in the history of social movement of Hong Kong, it is very common to see a strategy we call Samba, meaning 3 strikes. That means merchant strike, student strike, and also worker strike. So the leftists, by that time, employed this strategy as well. So they called for a merchant strike, a student strike, as well as a worker strike. So to spread and to escalate their protest, the struggle against the colonial government.
Before we go into more detail about how the strikes spread, Lala gave some background information on how the left and the FTU, the pro-Beijing Union Federation, worked.
So the leftist union by that time was really good at organizing workers. And by what I mean by they are really good at organizing workers, meaning that they see the worker not only as a worker, but also as a dad, for example, as a husband, as a person who needs recreation, as a teenager, let's say, or like as a family man, as a man who likes to go shopping, or as a man who needs education. So the leftist organizations, they have a whole network, including unions and schools and different shops. So they form a sort of network to make those workers being able to live in that network without going out to other networks. And so that explains why not only would the network able to organize or mobilize workers themselves, but very often they will mobilize the worker's family, because most often the whole family will already live in that leftist world. The leftists, they even have hospitals. They will have those doctors may not be licensed doctors, but they are very experienced doctors. So maybe they used to be in China and they come to Hong Kong, although they do not have a license, but they really have experience how to prescribe drugs on very popular disease or common cold. So because those hospitals are very, very cheap, those clinics actually, so it was very also welcomed by the workers and also their family members. So very often if you are a union member, your family will be in that network as well.
So essentially there was a whole parallel economy with schools, hospitals, shops, importers, all either run by the unions or by pro-PRC organisations or business people. Wildcat strikes began to break out mostly on the buses, on ferries, docks, utility companies, some government departments, and some textile factories, which employed mostly women workers. To try to quell the tide of protest, the government declared martial law and stepped up repression of workers' organisations.
According to Chui Yat Keung, I remember that there was a martial law enforcement by that time. So about 3 to 4 o'clock, people cannot go onto the street. This is something that I can remember. And I also heard that a lot of unions were, the police would broke into the union offices and then also hit a lot of workers and union members.
In this first phase of the protests, there were 4 really key events which led to the situation escalating.
According to Zhou Yick, a small conclusion, there are 3 dates that we need to remember about the 67 incident. The first date is the 6th of May of 1967. So it was the date where the police, they beat up workers from the plastic flower factory. The second date is the 11th of May. That was when the whole plastic flower factory strike spread. So people were rising up against the police, and the police continued to crack down, and people continued to fight back, and so go on and on. And the third date that we have to remember is the 22nd of May. It was after police beating up people and also the workers that the leftists, they organized members, union members, and other people, of course, to march to the government house peacefully. However, they were also beaten up by the police this time. After the march to the government house, the leftists, they form a committee, the struggle committee. The full name of the struggle committee is All Circles Anti-Persecution Struggle Committee. So the leftists, they organize different fractions in the society. They join into this committee and trying to turn it into a social movement. Another date that we shall remember is the 3rd of June. So what happened on the 3rd of June is that the People's Daily in mainland China published a leading article The title of the leading article is Anti All Kind of Provocations Done by the British Imperialism. So basically the article was supporting Hong Kong people to fight against the colonial government. So Chau Yick says he was very surprised when he first saw or read this article, mainly because he thought Hong Kong was strategically asked to anti-America instead of anti-colonialism. So he was very surprised to see there is a change in mainland China on the strategy or the tactic about Hong Kong.
Indeed, this appeared to be a seismic shift in the Chinese state approach to the British in Hong Kong. Prior to this point, Beijing had actually been pretty happy to use British Hong Kong as a trading conduit with the West. And so Chinese banks in Hong Kong were providing more than half of Beijing's foreign exchange. But as we will see, with all the domestic turbulence going on with the Cultural Revolution, it wasn't always clear which exact positions expressed by state-linked outlets actually reflected the official position of the state and whether or not that position would last. So the FTU decided to escalate their resistance.
So on the 24th of June, the general strike happened. The leftists, they organized 26 companies or units to join the strike, the worker strike, actually. Actually, it's a general strike. According to Zhou Yick, the general strike occurred on the 24th of June, and the police did something on the 23rd of June trying to scare people not to join the general strike. So on the 23rd, the police searched a union and then beat the union member and then causing the death of that worker. And there was also tear gas. So this was the police trying to threaten people from starting a general strike. But still the general strike happened on the 24th of June.
The general strike wasn't supposed to be general in the normal sense of the word, meaning everyone out. Instead, it was targeted at particular sectors of the economy.
According to Lam Bun, at that time when there was a general strike, the leftists, they didn't really ask all people to join the general strike. They were only targeting some industries or companies that was owned by KMT-friendly powers. For example, the textile factory, why they were encouraged to have a strike was because their boss was pro-KMT. And I have also heard that the Kowloon Bus Company, because the boss was pro-KMT, so the union really wanted the workers to continue to strike.
A number of women joined the strike, mainly at textile factories where the owners were linked with the Kuomintang. But elsewhere, women played an important role in encouraging their husbands and supporting them going on strike.
According to Lam Bun, very often when male workers are involved in the general strike or in any 67 incident or struggle or protest, their wife will be supporting them. And this is how some women are mobilized into the 67 struggle.
Although, of course, there were a couple of exceptions.
According to Chui Yat Keung. But according to my experience, what I witnessed is that my dad was really into the 67 incident and was acting mysteriously. And my mom was really angry about my dad, so he was trying to stop my dad from going out to the street.
Schoolgirls and boys were involved in the protests as well, demanding changes to the school curriculum. On one occasion, 13 schoolgirls refused to return to their classroom after a bell rang. One 15-year-old who was accused of being a ringleader involved in that was jailed for 1 month. Lala's research also uncovered some good examples of women's involvement in the protests.
According to the teaching of the Chinese Communist Party, they believe that women can also support like half of the sky, they say, because the sky is supported by both men and women. This is a saying, 女人能撑半边天. So there was, there wasn't any sort of like discrimination against women participating in the 67 protest or struggle. But because a lot of workers, they are men, mainly because those who joined the protest, the strike, are industries that are usually male workers. But there are still many examples of female taking part in the struggle. For example, what I have heard of, two examples. One is that a mother would use, a leftist mother actually. So by that time, giving out leaflets was considered a crime, so you can get arrested by handling leaflets. So a mother used her baby as some kind of protection or camouflage, so to reduce suspicion from the police, so she can continue to give out leaflets. So this is one example that I've heard of. And the second one is there was a mother who was also, of course, a leftist, because she was afraid that she would be arrested because of her participation in the protest. So she decided to stop breastfeeding her children, her kid. So the kid have to switch from like breastfeeding milk into congee in very early age, because the mother was too afraid that the baby will lose that kind of milk after she got arrested. So she had to make the baby get used to congee as soon as possible. So this is some of the examples that I have heard of.
That brings us to the end of part 1. Our Patreon supporters can listen to part 2 now. For everyone else, we'll be back next week, where we'll be talking about the response from colonial authorities, the extent of the strikes, and how the protests evolved into bombings and almost into guerrilla warfare. We also have exclusive revelations about one of Hong Kong's most notorious unsolved murders, so do check back next week. We would like to extend sincere thanks to our Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible. You too can support us and get exclusive early access to episodes, like part 2 of this, as well as bonus audio, free and discounted merch, and more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. That's patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link to that in the show notes as well. We're devoting loads of time to this podcast through 2019, but this is only really going to be sustainable beyond that if we get to around 1,000 patrons by the end of this year. So if you value what we do and appreciate that our main episodes are freely and publicly available for everyone, with no paywall, no corporate sponsors or adverts for overpriced mattresses or anything like that, please consider supporting us. If you can't afford it, absolutely no problem. Please just give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or share episodes on social media. Thanks, and catch you next time.